right, now we get to start a new unit, a unit on the modern world. And we will be covering 3 or 4 topics in this unit with such brevity, it is criminal. Seriously, we're going to cover the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the 19th century. And there is so much good stuff there, we could not possibly tackle it all. So we will be giving a aerial view, a very broad outline of the ideas that were developed in this time period. Okay. The first lecture we are going to tackle is the Renaissance. And there are a couple of things that I want a student to get out of this lecture. First, I want a student to be able to identify the intellectual shifts from the medieval period to the Renaissance that generated new approaches to art, politics, theology, etc. Secondly, I want the student to be able to identify characteristics in Renaissance art that illustrate the shift in intellectual movements. Art, I believe, is an application of dominant ideas. And we can read a painting, we can read a sculpture in order to get at the cultural values and the intellectual trends of a certain historical period and geographical location. All right. So let's talk about some of the intellectual currents that developed in late 15th, early 16th century Europe that we call the Renaissance. We had said from the beginning that the medieval period was thrown into chaos a bit by the fall of Rome, if we want to call it that. Okay? And the project of almost every civilization in the medieval period was to recapture the glory that was Rome. We talked a little bit about Geoffrey of Monmouth and the Britons and how they thought they had recaptured the glory of Rome. Charlemagne and his empire tried to recapture the glory of Rome. This idea of the Holy Roman Empire and the church tried to recapture the glory that was Rome. But through the medieval period, there were these 6 revolutions, these shifts in thinking. And after almost 1,000 years, Europe had determined that they were so far away from the ideals of classical culture, so far away from the glory that was Rome, they had to admit their failure. They had to admit that, no, this is not what we were after. And they tried to return to the classics, return to this ideal of Rome. And this return to the sources is what we refer to as the Renaissance. And it was a return to classical thinking in literature, in art, in philosophy, and even a bit in economic and political structure. And this was significant. This was new, this was different. It was an admission of the failure of the medieval period to return to classical ideals. So this is when they dubbed the medieval period the Dark Ages and tried to paint themselves as the return to classical sources, the return to classical ideals. Along with this classical vision, there was a return to this idea that man is the measure of all things. And this was reflected in their art and philosophy, and it was given a term, and the term is humanism. Humanism. The base of the word humanism is human. It was a return to the human. The medieval period was preoccupied with applying classical values to the Christian faith. And the focus of the medieval period had become so divine, so otherworldly, it seemed to ignore the value of the human. The pendulum had swung really far to one end, and the Renaissance tried to return it to its center, well, in so doing, swung it way to the other end. It was somewhat of a natural reaction to the focus on the divine. My opinion is the reintroduction of Aristotelian thinking was the spark, was the motivating factor. as long as the church, as long as the medieval period had defined itself in Platonic terms, valuing the world of ideas, the world of forms, the emphasis was taken off the material, and humans are material. Through the Crusades, through Thomas Aquinas, and this return to Aristotle, there was a new value put on the material world, which allowed humans to take center stage in how we think of the world around us. There were a couple of ways in which humanism manifests itself. First was an emphasis on the human body. We see humans, specifically nude humans, as being a theme in classical art, and since the Renaissance is a return to these classical ideals, we see a reemergence of nudes in sculpture and in painting, and this was a little different from the medieval period. Secondly, we see a return to the idea of human agency. There was a sense that man had more of an influence on the world around him than the medieval period would allow. The medieval period tended to explain things in terms of God and his will. Why did this happen? Well, God was angry or God was pleased. In the Renaissance era, this sense that man had more of a role in how the world unfolded led people to search for human answers to questions, especially in the realm of politics. So man began to seek his own answers to these questions and not rely as heavily on divine answers. And thirdly, there was an emphasis on the human record, the literature and the histories that man had written. It was a revitalization of classical sources. There was a return to Latin and Greek, which revived some of the old classics, Homer and Virgil and Cicero. But also keep in mind, this return to classical sources also fueled a return to biblical scholarship, a return to the written word of God as being foundational for the Christian faith. Later on, that would lead to the Reformation. But in the Renaissance, this movement was already occurring within the Catholic Church. It led to evaluating how does one interpret texts. It led to scholars such as Erasmus being able to compile different versions of the Bible to form a critical text. So the text was central to this idea of humanism. The text was central to this idea of returning to classical sources. All right. There's probably no better way to illustrate the effect of this thinking on the Renaissance period, this late 14th, 15th century, late 15th, early 16th century phenomena, than looking at art. Art was probably the most popular, the most apparent shift in this time period. We have a return to realism. While the Middle Ages had a lot of idealism, especially in Byzantine iconography, and idealism was great for portraying theological truths. It was an effective medium to talk about theology, to communicate theology. The Renaissance period saw this return to realism, especially in reference to the human body. Now, you can still talk about theological truths with realism, it's just different. And we'll look at a couple of examples where that's true. One of the most shocking, if we want to call it, shifts during this period was the use of color. It was vivid color, it was realistic color, it was color designed to elicit an emotional response from the viewer. We had the inclusion of perspective. While Byzantine art was very two-dimensional, with no backgrounds and not a whole lot of visual context, Renaissance artists put their subjects in a time and place, in situ, in a landscape or a countryside. They were in time and space. They were realistic. And they used this context, they used this landscape in order to communicate various truths. And they also developed visual perspective, the sense that things were further away and things were closer. During the medieval period, the reason why one figure was portrayed as smaller and another one larger was more of a statement of importance than it was any relative size. But in the Renaissance era, we see smaller people in the background and closer people in the foreground as more of an attempt at realism. We also see a shift in the subject. During the medieval period, with these unstable economies, the only source of funding for a lot of art was the church. So a lot of the art that we see during this period has religious themes as its subjects. With the stabilization of the economy during the Renaissance period, we now see private individuals having the money to sponsor art, and we see a shift in subjects to less religious portrayals. That doesn't mean that it does not have theological content. It doesn't even mean that it's not a religious painting. It is just not a painting about Jesus or Mary or John. It can be a painting about a classical figure or a family portrait or something like that. But we will look at how we can interpret these paintings in a minute. The person who is credited with changing this approach to art is an artist, Giotto. Giotto serves as a bridge in between Byzantine art and Renaissance humanism. Giotto took the static form of the icon and transformed it into a story. He portrayed the humans more realistically. He put these subjects in a context, in a landscape. And oftentimes he would paint a series of paintings to demonstrate a story and motion, which was absent in Byzantine iconography. One of the most clear examples of this shift is found in one of Giotto's pieces called the Ognissanti Madonna. The Madonna being Mary with child, Mary with the baby Jesus. If you examine this painting, the form of Mary looks very similar to a Byzantine icon. But if you look closely at the face is warmer. The face is three-dimensional. The face is full. If you look at the different people around Mary, they're not next to each other like in a Byzantine painting. They are overlapping each other. This gives the painting a sense of depth and perspective and space in this scene. This is real space. It's not symbolism. Okay? The face of Mary is full and it seems to peer out at the viewer, participating with the viewer. It's not the viewer looking at the painting. It's the painting and the viewer looking at each other. If you look on the sides, you see some Old Testament prophets looking through the openings in the throne. And these Old Testament prophets' faces are at three-quarter view. They're turned slightly to the side. If you look at Mary, she has the traditional Byzantine perspective being the frontal perspective. If you look at the angels and the other figures around Mary, they are shown in profile, both of which are two-dimensional. But if you look at these prophets on the sides of the throne, they're at three-quarter. They're three-dimensional. This was profoundly different than Byzantine iconography. A second artist that we're going to look at that demonstrates some of the new directions art took in the Renaissance is Botticelli. Botticelli painted a painting called The Birth of Venus. This painting was commissioned by the Medici family, not by the church. So it's not typical of a religious painting. That doesn't mean that it's without religious significance. The subject of this painting isn't Jesus or an apostle or a prophet. It's the goddess Venus from the classical period, reflecting this return to classical sources. You notice that Venus herself is nude and trying to cover herself up a little bit. And this is consistent with a classical portrayal of the human body, not a medieval portrayal. Venus herself was the goddess of beauty and love. And theologically in this time period, God was portrayed as representing beauty and love. So there are many who speculate that this painting is an attempt on the Medici family's part to reconcile a commitment to the Christian life in the church with this revival of the classical ideal. Revival of the classical ideal. There's a figure on the right-hand side of this painting, and she's ready to clothe Venus as Venus comes off this shell. And this person represents a new season, the season of spring. Well, if Botticelli was ushering in spring, that means that these Renaissance painters saw the medieval period as winter. And during the Renaissance is when we have the phrase, the Dark Ages, being coined. If you look at the use of color in this painting, everything has a warm glow to it. And you can even see on the edges of the leaves this warm glow, a new use of color. This painting is set on a lake. It's in real time and real space. And on the left you have two figures, Zephyr and Chloris, and they are blowing Venus across this lake. There's a sense of motion here. So Botticelli's Birth of Venus is an excellent illustration of the shifts that were occurring in art and the ideas that drove these shifts. Now we're going to talk about a third artist, one of my personal favorites. And what's different about this artist is he was not an Italian painter from the High Renaissance. He was a later Northern European painter, a guy named Grinev. And his most famous work is the Isenheim altarpiece, a stunning and shocking portrayal of Christ's crucifixion. Grinev was an architect, engineer, as well as a painter. And he very effectively captures the pain and the suffering that Christ is enduring on the cross. It is a brutal depiction of his body on the cross. Now, most interpreters would say that in this picture, Christ is dead. This is, Christ's head is down, his eyes are closed. In my personal opinion, he is not dead. If you look at his hands and the tension and the angst and the pain that are represented in the hands, that is a portrayal of a person that is actively undergoing suffering. So in my opinion, Christ is not dead yet. It is a depiction of the suffering of Christ. If you look at the people around Jesus, on the left-hand side, you have the traditional historical figures of the crucifixion. St. John the Evangelist, Mary, mother of Jesus, and Mary Magdalene. Jesus asked John to take care of his mother, and in this painting, John is taking care of his mother, dressed all in white, a symbol of purity. On the right-hand side of the cross, there are two symbolic figures. The person is St. John the Baptist. Now, at the time of the crucifixion, the Bible tells us that St. John the Baptist had died much earlier. So he really does not belong in a historical treatment of the crucifixion there. And he is pointing at Jesus and saying, I must decrease so he can increase. He's there for you and I. That is this piece's message to you and I. And also on the right-hand side, we see a bleeding lamb with a cross next to it. And this represents the innocence of Christ. Now, Grinev was painting around 1510, around the beginning of the 16th century. And I believe that this picture is an expression of the apocalyptic imagination that was running wild at this point in time. As the 1400s were coming to a close, there was a lot of fear and trepidation about what the 1500s would bring. And around the 1500s, there was this apocalyptic fervor that the end of the world was coming and things were going downhill really quick. Not unlike what we saw with Y2K and that hysteria there, or the Mayan apocalypse, or whatever it is in our own day. A couple of things that that points to this. If you look at the upper right-hand corner of the Isenheim altarpiece, you see a monster breaking through a window there, breathing into the scene. That's very much an apocalyptic image. And I believe that the inclusion of the Lamb is a reference to the book of Revelation, another apocalyptic scene. This is a dark, emotional piece that motivates the viewer to seek salvation in a manner that prefigures some of the artistic and theological calls for indulgences in Luther's day, which we will get to in our next lecture. Now, the three artists I talked about were not the members of the Mount Rushmore of Italian Renaissance. It wasn't Michelangelo or Raphael or Donatello or Leonardo da Vinci. And like I said, this is this lecture on the Renaissance is criminally negligent in its brevity. There is so much more here, and you guys will have an opportunity to explore that through outside videos. But I wanted to take the opportunity to demonstrate, that there are new ideas that are being introduced into Europe during this time period. And these ideas motivated change in culture. These ideas motivated change in art. And we could also study politics and music and all that. But I think looking at these three artists give us a very clear illustration of the influence on these new ideas during the Renaissance. Thank you.